Hey, and welcome, gurus, to this lesson, Azure Firewall Rules and Policies. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this lesson that we're going to start diving a little bit deeper into Azure Firewall. We learned about what Azure Firewall was in a previous lesson, but now we're going to be diving deeper into describing the types of rules that we have on our Azure Firewall. And then we're going to slightly touch back on taking a look at the types of rule management we have, such as classic rule management, as well as the new policy-based rule management. And then we're going to dive a step deeper into policy-based rule management so that we can understand the hierarchy of firewall policies for this new style of managing rules for Azure Firewall. And then we're going to take a look at the PEMDAS for Azure Firewall rules so that we can understand the order of operations, right? I'm saying PEMDAS not because we actually have a PEMDAS, but we do have an order of operations for evaluating our firewall rules so that we understand how best to set up our rules so that traffic is filtered in the way we intended. And then we're going to wrap up this lesson with some key takeaways. All right, gurus, without further ado, let's get started. All right, so I think it goes without saying that rules are really everything for our Azure firewalls, right? Because we're trying to filter network traffic for multiple networks. These are our virtual networks, our networks on premises, in hybrid network situations, in a typical hub and spoke design for our networks. And when we are talking about Azure Firewall rules, we're really talking about three different types of rules. We have our DNAT rules, and these are the rules that take a source IP, like the client IP, that is requesting traffic over a public IP, which might be the public IP of the firewall, and over a specific port like 22 for getting a SSH session into that firewall. But what we're really trying to do is map it to maybe a jump box that's behind that firewall. And so we convert that public traffic into private traffic, making it a private IP and port that is actually mapped to that public IP and port. And this is DNAT, so Destination Network Address Translation. Then we have our network rules. And our network rules are those rules that are similar to the network security group security rules, right? We have a source IP and port that is trying to reach out to a specific destination, right? And that IP and port as well. And then the protocol it's trying to reach out over. Then we have our application rules. And these are rules that might look something like we're trying to get a source IP and map it to a fully qualified domain name. And for each of these rule types, we have what are known as rule collections for each type. So we have a collection of rules for DNAT, we have a collection of network rules, and a collection of application rules. And these rule collections contain all the rules for each type corresponding to its type of rule collection. Now that we understand the rules that are in play, let's quickly just refer back to classic rule management. In classic rule management of our firewalls, we have our firewall resource. And then we would have our DNAT rule collection, our network rule collection, and our application rule collection. And each of these is going to have a priority, right? They could all have the priority of 100. And we could have multiple rule collections for each type. So multiple DNAT rule collections, network rule collections, and application rule collections. And they'll be evaluated by their priority number. And the lower the priority number, the higher the precedence that rule takes over the other rules of the same type of rule collection. And these are all associated and administered at the firewall resource, right? They're specifically on the firewall resource itself. The priority range we have for these rule collections is 100 to 65,000. And the way we evaluate this is we look at the DNAT rules first, the network rules, and then the application rules. And we look at them in order of priority based on the rule type that they have. Now, in classic rule management, the issue we run into really here is if we have multiple firewalls, we're going to have some administrative overhead of having to administer these firewalls and their rule collections separately because these are two separate resources and the firewall rules exist independently on each resource. So we don't have a way of abstracting those rules away from the firewall resource itself. And this is the problem that policy-based rule management fixes for us by providing us the need for less administrative overhead. Now, the same rule types apply here. Our DNAT rules, our network rules, as well as our application rules. And we still have the idea of rule collections of various priorities for each type, right? 100, 200, 300, as far as a priority number for the DNAT rule collections. Same thing for our net rule collections. We might have multiple rule collections and we'll put them in a priority. The lower the number, between 165,000, the higher priority that collection has. And then we have the same thing with application rules. So all of these rule collections, though, will go into what is known as a rule collection group. And we can actually assign a priority to the rule collection group itself as well, because we can end up with multiple rule collection groups. For example, we might have 2 rule collection groups, one with a priority of 100 and the other with a priority of 200. And we will look at the rule collection group with the lower priority number first, because it has a priority number that comes before the next priority of 200. And all of this gets grouped into a policy object. So we have our rule collection groups existing inside of our policy. And in each of these rule collection groups, we have our rule collections of DNAT, net, and application rules. Now, with this, we could have multiple policies, right? We could have policy 1, policy 2, each with multiple rule collection groups that have priorities, and inside of those rule collections for DNAT, network, and application rules. And those rule collections have priorities, and then the actual rules exist on those rule collections. And the great thing about policy-based rule management is this is abstracted away from our firewalls. So we could say we want to apply policy 1 to firewall 1 and firewall 2, and we want to apply policy 2 to firewall 2. And this allows us to be able to administer more easily our policies so that we can control the rules separately from the firewall resource. And all of this is possible through the use of Azure Firewall Manager, which is our global resource for administering our policies and our Azure Firewall resources. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, this is a lot of information to take in, and it's kind of hard to keep straight the hierarchy of everything with all these layers of abstraction. So let's make it simple here by using an example. Let's say we have 4 firewalls, and we create a parent policy, because the great thing about policies is that policy resources allow us to have a parent and child relationship with our policies. So let's just say that this parent policy is a policy where we have all the rules that we've decided that we will use across all firewalls for our organization. They're reusable, and that's why we've placed them in the parent policy. And then we create a child policy 1 and a child policy 2. And each of these is actually going to inherit the rules from the parent policy, because again, these are the reusable rules that we're going to use across all firewalls. But maybe in child policy 1, we have some different rules that we don't have in child policy 2, and vice versa. And the decision to organize our firewall rules in this way could come down to something as simple as that firewall 1 and 2 maybe need specific rules that are in child policy 1, plus those rules that are inherited by child policy 1 from the parent policy. And then maybe firewall 3 just needs the parent policy rules, and then the firewall 4 maybe needs the rules that are inherited by child policy 2 from the parent policy, plus the rules that exist on child policy 2. Now, the same thing goes for the order of operations, right? We evaluate the parent policy first and then onto the child policy. And whenever we're associating our policies to our firewall resources, we have to keep in mind that this costs money, right? Specifically $100 per month per region for each policy that is over one association. So let's just say all these firewalls are inside of the same region. Well, they have an association with the parent policy, either directly or indirectly through inheritance of a child policy. And what that would mean here is it's $100 per month per region for each policy over one association. And so because we have 4 associations here, either indirect or directly, it's $100 per association for our parent policy. Now we also have another association for a policy that's actually over one association, and that's those for child policy 1. For child policy 1 here, we have 2 associations. And assuming these are all still in the same region, that would be $100 per association, so another $200. And that would make all of this a total of $600. And the reason that we haven't talked about child policy 2 is because child policy 2 itself only has one association, meaning that it's free. And we're not accounting for the parent policy association because we already did the math for that, because we were talking about the direct and indirect associations that policy had. Now that we've covered the hierarchy of firewall policies and parent and child relationship that they have and the costs associated with putting those policies to firewalls, let's talk about the PEMDAS of firewall rules here so that we can understand how things are evaluated. Plain and simple, at the end of the day, if you need a quick and easy way to determine how traffic is flowing, keep in mind that DNAT is evaluated first, network, and then application rules after that. This is regardless of the rule collection groups, the rule collections, and the policy inheritance between a parent and child policy. And these Azure Firewall rules are terminating, which means if we get a rule match, the traffic stops there and it takes that rule and puts it into play. Now, I think it's easier to understand the order of operations of evaluating how we look at what rules take precedence over other rules by actually having an example. So let's say we have a parent policy here, right? And inside of this parent policy, we have our rule collection groups, and then inside of those are rule collections for DNAT, net, and application rules, and then the rules exist actually within those rule collections. Now let's say we have policy 2, right? This could be the child policy of policy 1. And it has all of the same components, the rule collection groups, the rule collections, and the rules that exist inside of those rule collections of each type. And it's inheriting all of those rules that are on policy 1, plus it has its own rules. So the order of operations when evaluating what rules take precedence here is, first, we look at the parent policy. And then we go to the rule collection group that has the lowest priority number. So the first rule collection group in this case. And then we would go into looking at first the DNAT rules inside of this rule collection group. And if we had multiple rule collections for DNAT rules, we would evaluate those in order by lowest priority number. And then we move into the network rules, and we'll do the same thing with the network rules. And then after we've done that, we move into the application rules, and we evaluate those the same as well. And then after evaluating all those rule collections inside of our rule collection group 1, we then move into the next rule collection group with the next lowest priority. And then we do the same thing for all of those rule collections that exist in there and all of those rules. And then finally, we can move into the child policy. And inside of the child policy, we're going to follow the same order of operations. And again, the important thing to remember is that these firewall rules are terminating. So as soon as we get a match, that rule goes into a play and the evaluation of other rules stops right there because we found a matching rule. Now that we've covered all these things for Azure Firewall rules, the types of policy management, the hierarchy, and the actual costs that are associated with the associations of those firewall policy resources to Azure Firewall resources, and we looked at how we actually evaluate what rules go into play, let's actually wrap up this lesson with some key takeaways here. If you take away anything from this lesson, it's important to understand that Azure Firewall has 3 rule types here. We have our DNAT rules, our network rules, and our application rules. And then we have the rule management options of having classic rules that exist on the firewall resource. And this gives us more administrative overhead, which is solved by policy-based rules, which abstract away policies and puts them into a separate resource so that we can administer them all from Azure Firewall Manager. Now, when we're evaluating those policies hierarchy and the objects that exist inside of them, we have to understand that the association between parent and child policy is that of inheritance from the parent to the child. And then we have to understand that inside of each policy, we have those policy objects, we have the rule collection groups, the rule collections of the various rule types, and then the actual rules for that rule type that exist there. And whenever we're evaluating order of operations, the quickest and easiest way to understand is to know that DNAT rules come first, and whenever those rules are accepted, then we move on to network rules, and then after that, application rules in our evaluation of order of operations. All right, gurus, that's everything for now about Azure Firewall rules and policies. Thanks so much for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lessons where we're actually going to get to be playing around with policies and rules. So, I'll see you in the next lesson.